Ladies and gentlemen, silence is often misunderstood in a world that constantly demands action, noise, and movement. We equate success with busyness and productivity, rarely allowing ourselves the space to embrace quiet. But true strength does not come from how much we do. It comes from the moments we pause, reflect, and listen. Silence is not a weakness. It is not an absence of power, but rather the source of it. It is in the stillness that we gain clarity, perspective, and resilience. When we allow ourselves to step away from the noise of the world, we open the door to something far greater. In our daily lives, we are surrounded by distractions, our phones buzzing with notifications, emails demanding attention, conversations filling our minds with endless thoughts. We have become so accustomed to constant engagement that silence feels uncomfortable. We avoid it, filling every moment with some form of stimulation. But when we remove these distractions, we are left with what truly matters. We are left with the opportunity to connect deeply with ourselves and with God. Strength is not found in how well we can juggle everything, but in how well we can surrender to the quiet and allow it to shape us. When we look at some of the most influential and resilient people in history, we find a common thread. They understood the value of silence. They knew that wisdom does not come from reacting to every situation immediately, but from taking a step back, from allowing space for reflection. Great leaders, thinkers, and spiritual guides have always emphasized the need for quiet contemplation. Jesus himself often withdrew to be alone, to pray, and to reconnect with his Father. He did not rely on the crowds or the noise to guide him. He sought the silence, where true guidance and strength were found. In moments of silence, we confront our true selves. There is no mask to wear, no expectations to meet. It is just us and God. It is in this space that we discover what lies beneath the surface of our daily routines. Are we at peace, or are we running from something? Are we confident in who we are, or are we seeking validation from the outside world? Silence strips away the distractions and forces us to be honest. And in that honesty, we find the foundation of strength. Silence is not passive, it is active. It requires courage to sit with our thoughts, to face our fears, and to listen for God's voice rather than drowning it out with our own. It is far easier to keep moving, to keep busy, to keep talking, but true strength is found in the ability to be still, to wait, to trust that in the quiet, God is working. We may not always hear him immediately. The answers we seek may not come in the way we expect, but silence gives space for growth, for transformation, for deep inner strength to take root. When we embrace silence, we become more intentional. Our actions are no longer driven by reaction, but by purpose. We make decisions not out of impulse, but out of wisdom. We speak not just to fill the air, but to bring life to those around us. Silence sharpens our focus, allowing us to distinguish between what is important and what is merely noise. It teaches us patience, reminding us that not everything requires an immediate response. Strength is not always in the ability to act quickly. Sometimes it is in the ability to wait, to discern, to move when the time is right. In silence, we often suppress our emotions just to keep up. We tell ourselves we don't have time to process pain, disappointment, or uncertainty. But silence allows us to face these things, to bring them before God, to let him work in the places we have ignored. True strength does not come from avoiding pain, but from walking through it with faith. Silence gives us the space to acknowledge our struggles and to receive the peace that surpasses all understanding. The noise of life can be overwhelming, filling our minds with doubt, fear, and confusion. But when we embrace silence, we shift our focus. We move away from the distractions and draw nearer to the truth. We remind ourselves that our strength is not found in the external, but in the internal. It is not in what the world says about us, but in what God whispers to us when we take the time to listen. Silence anchors us, grounds us, and prepares us to step back into the world with renewed confidence and clarity. Silence is a discipline. It is something we must practice, something we must choose. It is easy to get caught up in the whirlwind of daily life. to convince ourselves that we do not have time for quiet moments with God. But the reality is, we cannot afford to go without them. Silence is where we recharge. It is where we realign our hearts with His will. It is where we strengthen our faith and our resolve. The world will always demand more from us, but in the quiet, we remember that our worth is not in what we do, but in who we are. In the moments of silence, we hear what we would otherwise miss. We notice the gentle nudges, the quiet reassurances, the deep truths that get lost in the noise. We gain wisdom, not because we are striving for it, but because we have made space for it. We experience peace, not because life is suddenly free of challenges, but because we have chosen to rest in God's presence rather than fight the chaos alone. Silence is not empty. It is full of meaning, full of purpose, full of power. We often think of strength as something loud, something forceful, but true strength is often quiet. It does not need to prove itself. It simply is. It is the unwavering faith in the midst of uncertainty, the calm in the middle of a storm, the steady resolve that comes from knowing who we are and whose we are. It is in silence that we cultivate this strength. It is in silence that we prepare ourselves to face the noise of the world without being shaken by it. The choice to embrace silence is a choice to embrace strength. It is a decision to trust that in the quiet, we are not alone, that in the stillness, we are being renewed, that in the moments where nothing seems to be happening, everything is falling into place. The world may see silence as weakness, but we know better, because in the silence, we are not just waiting, we are listening, we are growing, we are becoming exactly who we were created to be. We live in a world where words dominate our interactions. From conversations with friends and family to social media posts and endless streams of news, we are constantly surrounded by noise. We often feel the need to fill the silence, to speak up, to make our voices heard. But what if the most powerful moments in our spiritual journey are not found in speaking, but in listening? What if, instead of trying to talk our way through life, we learn to be still and let God speak to us? Listening is an act of surrender. It requires us to set aside our own agendas, to quiet our thoughts, and to truly focus on what is being said. When we come before God, we often bring a long list of requests, concerns, and desires. We tell Him what we need, what we hope for, and what we fear. While prayer is an essential part of our relationship with Him, it is not just about speaking. It is also about making room to hear His response. If we spend all our time talking, we may miss the very answers we are seeking. The voice of God is not always loud. It is not always dramatic. It is often found in the still, small whispers that we can only hear when we choose to be quiet. When we read about Elijah in the Bible, we see a man who experienced incredible miracles: fire from heaven, supernatural provision, mighty victories. And yet, when he was at his lowest, God did not come to him in a powerful wind, an earthquake, or a raging fire. He came in a gentle whisper. That whisper carried more power than any force of nature because it was personal, intimate, and filled with truth. It is the same with us. God does not need to shout over the noise of our lives. He simply waits for us to listen. Listening requires patience. It is not something that happens instantly or on demand. We have been conditioned to expect immediate answers, quick responses, and fast results, but God operates on a different timeline. When we take the time to listen, we step into His rhythm rather than trying to force Him into ours. We slow down, we breathe, we create space for Him to move, and in that space, we begin to recognize His voice. One of the biggest challenges in listening is learning to silence the distractions around us. The world constantly competes for our attention. Our phones, our responsibilities, our worries, all of these things create noise that can drown out the voice of God. But when we intentionally set aside time to listen, we train our hearts to recognize what truly matters. Just as a musician must tune their instrument before playing, we must tune our hearts to hear God's voice. This takes practice, discipline, and a willingness to let go of the things that keep us from focusing on Him. Listening also requires humility. It is easy to assume that we already know what is best for our lives. We make plans, set goals, and move forward with confidence. But when we listen to God, we acknowledge that His ways are higher than ours. We admit that we do not have all the answers and that we need His guidance. This is not always easy. It means being willing to change course, to let go of our own desires, and to trust that He sees the bigger picture. It means being open to correction, to wisdom that may challenge us, and to direction that may take us out of our comfort zones. Throughout the Bible, we see the power of listening. Moses listened when God called him from the burning bush. Samuel listened when God spoke to him in the middle of the night. Mary listened when the angel told her she would give birth to the Savior. Their willingness to listen changed the course of history. What if we approached our own lives with the same openness? What if we chose to listen, not just when it was convenient, but in every moment? Listening is not passive. It is an active choice to engage with God in a deeper way. It means paying attention to the ways He speaks, whether through Scripture, through others, or through the quiet stirrings in our hearts. It means being aware of His presence in the ordinary moments of life, not just in the big, dramatic experiences. Sometimes, God speaks through a verse that jumps off the page, a conversation that brings clarity, or a moment of peace that reminds us He is near. The more we listen, the more we recognize His voice. When we listen, we gain wisdom. Proverbs tells us that a wise person listens more than they speak. Wisdom is not found in how much we say, but in how well we understand. When we take the time to listen to God, we align ourselves with His wisdom rather than relying on our own limited perspective. We make decisions with greater clarity, respond to challenges with greater peace, and walk through life with a deeper sense of purpose. Listening strengthens our faith. It reminds us that God is actively involved in our lives, that He cares about the details, and that He is always speaking. When we hear His voice, even in the smallest ways, it builds our trust in Him. It reassures us that we are not alone, that we are being guided, and that He is working even when we cannot see it. Faith is not just believing that God exists. It is believing that He is present, that He speaks, and that His voice is worth listening to. In a world that values speaking, arguing, and proving a point, listening is a radical act. It goes against the grain of culture. It requires us to slow down, to be intentional, and to resist the urge to fill every moment with noise. But in that choice, we find something far greater. We find the peace that comes from knowing we do not have to figure everything out on our own. We find the wisdom that guides us when we feel lost. We find the assurance that God is near, that He is speaking, and that His voice is the one worth following. Life is a constant cycle of movement, responsibilities, and expectations. From the moment we wake up, our minds are flooded with tasks to complete, people to meet, and goals to achieve. We push ourselves to keep going, believing that success is measured by how much we accomplish. Rest often feels like a luxury, something we can afford only after everything else is done. But the truth is, rest is not a reward for hard work. It is a necessity. It is not an afterthought, but an essential part of living with purpose. Without rest, we burn out. Without quiet moments to refuel, we lose sight of why we are doing what we are doing in the first place. Rest is not just about physical relaxation. It is about spiritual renewal. It is about creating space in our lives to reconnect with God, to realign our hearts, and to remember what truly matters. We often think of rest as idleness, as doing nothing, but true rest is deeply intentional. It is a choice to step away from distractions, to pause, and to find stillness in His presence. It is in those moments of quiet that we are reminded that our worth is not in what we do, but in who we are. God Himself established the importance of rest from the very beginning. After creating the heavens and the earth, He rested on the seventh day. He did not rest because He was tired. He rested to set an example for us. He knew that we would need the reminder that life is not meant to be lived in constant motion. He designed us to function best when we balance work with rest, when we take time to breathe, to reflect, and to simply be. When we neglect rest, we begin to feel its effects. Stress becomes overwhelming, our patience wears thin, and we find ourselves running on empty. We try to push through, believing that if we just work a little harder, we will finally catch up. But exhaustion is not a sign of strength. It is a sign that we have been relying too much on our own abilities and not enough on God. Rest is an act of trust. It is saying, God, I believe that you are in control, and I do not have to do everything on my own. It is surrendering the need to always be in motion and allowing him to carry what we cannot. Jesus often demonstrated the importance of rest in his own life. Despite the demands of his ministry, he regularly withdrew to quiet places to pray. He knew that pouring into others required first being filled himself. He did not allow the urgency of the world around him to dictate his schedule. He understood that rest was necessary for strength, clarity, and purpose. If Jesus, the Son of God, made rest a priority, how much more do we need it? Rest is where we find renewal. It is where we recover from the battles we face daily, whether they are physical, emotional, or spiritual. When we take time to rest in God's presence, we are reminded that we are not alone, that we are deeply loved, and that he is working even when we are still. The world tells us that productivity is the key to success, but God tells us that abiding in him is the key to a fulfilled life. When we rest in him, we gain new strength. We are not just pausing, we are preparing. Rest restores our perspective. When we are constantly on the go, it is easy to become consumed by our problems, our to-do lists, and our worries. Everything feels urgent, and we lose sight of the bigger picture. But when we take time to rest, to sit in silence, and to be with God, we see things differently. We remember that he is greater than our struggles, that he holds our future in his hands, and that we do not have to have everything figured out. There is a reason why God calls us to be still. Stillness allows us to hear his voice. It allows us to receive his peace. It allows us to slow down long enough to recognize his presence. We miss the moments where he is trying to show us something new, something deeper. But in rest, we open ourselves to receive. We make space for him to speak, to comfort, and to strengthen us for what lies ahead. Rest is not something we should feel guilty about. It is not a sign of laziness or weakness. It is a divine invitation to experience the fullness of life the way God intended. He does not want us to be drained, overwhelmed, or constantly striving. He wants us to live from a place of peace, a place of trust, a place of knowing that we are fully held in his care. When we prioritize rest, we are not neglecting our responsibilities. We are equipping ourselves to fulfill them more effectively. The world may not always understand the value of rest, but God does. He designed us to function best when we take time to pause, to breathe, and to dwell in his presence. Rest is not the absence of responsibility. It is the foundation of strength. It is where we regain the energy to keep going, where we find the clarity to make wise decisions, and where we experience the love and peace that sustain us. Faith is not just something we declare, it is something we cultivate. It is not a switch we turn on and off, but a relationship that grows over time. Just as a seed needs soil, water, and sunlight to develop into a strong tree, faith needs stillness, reflection, and connection with God to grow deep and unshakable. In the stillness, we learn to trust, to listen, and to surrender. It is in the quiet moments, away from the distractions of the world, that our faith is strengthened. We often associate faith with action, taking bold steps, moving forward, doing more. While action is an important part of faith, it is not the foundation. The foundation of faith is found in stillness, in the quiet places where we allow God to speak, to lead, and to shape us. When we are constantly moving, constantly busy, we may mistake our own efforts for faith. But true faith is not about striving, it is about trusting. It is about knowing that even when we are still, God is working. The Bible is filled with moments where stillness precedes great acts of faith. Before Moses parted the Red Sea, he first had to stand still and trust in God's power. Before David faced Goliath, he spent years in quiet moments with God as a shepherd. Before Jesus began his ministry, he spent 40 days in the wilderness, fasting, praying, and preparing. In each of these cases, faith was not built in the noise, but in the silence. It was in the moments of stillness that their trust in God deepened, that their confidence in his promises grew, and that they became ready for what was ahead. Stillness allows us to shift our focus. When we are constantly surrounded by noise, whether it is external distractions or internal worries, it becomes difficult to hear God's voice. We become consumed by our own thoughts, our own fears, and our own plans. But when we intentionally step into quiet moments, we make space to hear something greater. We give ourselves the opportunity to listen, to reflect, and to remember that faith is not about controlling every outcome, but about surrendering to the one who already knows the outcome. Fear and doubt often grow in the absence of stillness. When we do not take time to be quiet with God, we become more susceptible to the voices of the world. Voices that tell us we are not enough, that we have to figure everything out on our own, that we need to keep moving or else we will fall behind. But faith is the opposite of fear. Faith reminds us that we are not alone. Stillness allows us to drown out the lies and replace them with truth. When we take time to be still, we recognize how much God has already done. We begin to see his hand in our lives in ways we may have overlooked in the rush of daily life. Gratitude grows in the quiet. Reflection deepens our trust. We remember the prayers he has answered, the doors he has opened, and the times he has carried us when we thought we could not go any further. Faith does not grow through constant movement. It grows through moments of recognizing God's faithfulness in the past and trusting him for the future. Stillness also teaches us patience. Faith is not about instant results. It is not about getting what we want the moment we ask for it. It is about trusting that God's timing is perfect, even when it does not align with our own. In stillness, we learn to wait, to rest, and to believe that delays are not denials. We begin to understand that sometimes the greatest work God is doing in our lives is happening beneath the surface, beyond what we can see. Just as a tree's roots grow deep before its branches reach high, our faith deepens in the unseen moments before we step into the fullness of God's plans. There is a peace that comes with stillness, a peace that surpasses understanding, that quiets anxious hearts, that reminds us that no matter what is happening around us, God is in control. When we take time to be still with him, we allow his peace to replace our worries, his strength to replace our exhaustion, and his wisdom to replace our confusion. The world teaches us that peace comes from having everything figured out. But God's peace comes from knowing that we do not have to figure it all out on our own. Stillness is an act of faith. It is choosing to believe that God is working even when we do not see immediate results. It is trusting that he is speaking even when we do not hear an audible voice. It is knowing that his presence is enough, that we do not need to chase after things to feel complete. When we embrace stillness, we are not doing nothing. We are allowing our faith to take root, to grow stronger, and to prepare us for what God has in store.